Okay,
Warming up.
Moving on from fires now. Angry protests broke out in Central Australia this week after the fatal police shooting of a young man in Yuendumu. Within days, a 28-year-old policeman was charged with murder. David, something I don't think has happened before in a shooting like this, has it?
It appears, if it's not absolutely unprecedented, there's nothing been quite like it before. We have to, of course, be very careful talking about this because it is sub judice. A police officer, 2 days, 3 days after the death of Kumanjai Walker, was charged with murder by the DPP after consultation with the DPP in the Northern Territory. It is absolutely astonishing. We've all been around long enough to see efforts over decades to try to deal with the scale of death of Indigenous prisoners, people in police custody, people at the point of arrest. This is the most dramatic move that I've seen in that time.
Just it's opened up a wider debate. We saw the Indigenous Affairs Minister, Ken Wyatt. He was in the Territory during the week when that happened. He then went and sat down with some of the elders from Yuendumu and talked about what the government is doing to try and boost local empowerment. Linda Burney, she was in Canberra and she tried to put the local anger in a broader context.
There's a broader issue as well, and that's the frustration of people living in the Territory, particularly First Nations people. The blanket introduction of cashless debit card next year, the extreme poverty in communities, the lack of clean water, the lack of secure food source, and of course the remnants of the intervention some 12 years ago. These are the frustrations that people are also voicing.
And Patricia, in this case, there were no health services open on Yuendumu at that point because the staff had left earlier that day because of safety concerns. So it's sort of pulled a veil back, really, hasn't it?
It certainly has. And let's just put it into context. It's been 30 years since the Royal Commission reported on deaths in custody. And we've had, what, I forgot the latest figure because it rises all the time, but, you know, well over 400 deaths in custody. The figures are staggering, and the death of this 19-year-old, I think, has been one of those watershed moments in the country. Those protests we've seen, not just in Alice Springs, but across the country, are, I think, a moment where not just the Aboriginal community, but the rest of the community too says, this isn't good enough. Why haven't these recommendations been taken seriously? How many Royal Commissions do you need? And look, I'll just give you one example, and it's a Victorian example, but the death of Tanya Day, public drunkenness. It was 30 years ago that the Royal Commission, Fran, suggested that public drunkenness shouldn't be an offence.
Get rid of it.
And it was only in August that the Victorian government managed to make it not, no longer illegal. What does that tell us? We've been given all the advice. We don't need more Royal Commissions. What we need is, I think, political leadership to take this seriously, think about resourcing, and these desperately poor communities. This dysfunction comes from poverty. And I want to sort of say something positive about the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt, who, yes, has met with those Yuendumu leaders and has actually been asked to go to Yuendumu, and he said he will. So I think that will be a pivotal moment and talk about resourcing and about that place, because zooming out from this one death, because of course there's going to be, court proceedings and fair enough, leave people to have a fair trial. But we're going to have another conversation, not just a knee-jerk one, but about community policing, guns in communities, and community safety.
Yeah, and that's where the community is taking it, interestingly. I mean, they've responded, I think, in an admirable fashion, really, so far. Another story this week, Beirut's